Hello, wonderful students of YouTube. Today we are going to look at how to write a Band 9 Academic Task 1 essay, and we are going to be focusing especially on how to write a line graph for this part of the exam. So this is the graph that we're going to be having a look at. So let's focus quickly on the title. So it says the graph below shows the annual expenditure in New Zealand by tourists from 5 different countries. We need to summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Always make sure that you read the title carefully, as it's going to have a lot of important information in it. When we have a look at our graph, along the vertical axis, we have expenditure in New Zealand dollars. Along the horizontal axis, we have the year. And this line graph shows us data about 5 different countries. So the structure of an academic task 1 essay is always going to be 4 parts. You start with your introduction. It is followed with an overview. After that, we have details paragraph 1, and finally, details paragraph 2. Note, we do not have a conclusion. It's really important that you do not write a conclusion for this type of essay. In your introduction, you are basically paraphrasing the title. Your overview, you are giving key features, so general features of the graph. And then in your 2 details paragraphs, you're giving specific details about data in the graph. So let's start off looking at the introduction. As I mentioned before, the introduction is simply a paraphrase of the title. So if we look at the title at the top here, it says the graph below shows the annual expenditure in New Zealand by tourists from 5 different countries. So the way I went about paraphrasing this sentence was I wrote the line chart. So a graph and a chart are the same thing. We don't need to worry about the word below. Illustrates instead of shows, and then how much money was spent annually instead of writing the annual expenditure. Next, I mentioned by visitors instead of by tourists, and then from 5 nations instead of 5 different countries to New Zealand. So the key synonyms we were using here was shows, which we can use as illustrates. You could also replace illustrates with displays information about. Annual expenditure, we changed with how much money was spent annually. Tourists, we changed for visitors. And 5 countries, we changed for 5 nations. Once we've finished with our introduction, now we have a great paraphrase, and we're going to move on to our next paragraph, which is the overview. The important thing to remember when writing your overview is we are not going to include any details. So there's going to be no dates and no statistics. We are just stating the key features of the graph. Always take notes of the years that are in the graph, and then we're going to know what tense to write the essay in. If we look at this graph here, it's between 1996 and 2014. Both of these years are in the past, so every year that it is covering is going to be in the past. That means we are talking about completed actions in the past, and we will be using the past simple. In your overview, you want between 2 and 4 key features. The best way to look for key features, when you've got graphs which show trends over time, which is a graph like this, we will be looking if our categories increase, decrease, fluctuate, or stable. And then when we're thinking about comparing and contrasting data, we think about what is the highest data and what is the lowest data. If we have a look at this graph, we can actually see that all of the data is increasing. The best thing to do is just draw a line from the first date, so 1996, to the last date. So the key features that I came up with here were all countries increased, but I did say despite some fluctuations, because at some points they decreased. But the general trend, and remember that is what we're trying to talk about, not details, trends. The general trends for all countries were they increased. Because everything is doing exactly the same, to find some extra key features, because we need at least two, I'm looking at the highest and lowest data. Well, Australian tourists spent the most, and we can see Chinese tourists spent the least for the majority of the period. So to put this into a paragraph, we start all our overviews with overall. Then I said the spending by tourists of all the 5 countries increased over the period, despite some fluctuations. Throughout the period, Australian tourists spent the most, while Chinese tourists spent the least for the majority of the time. You'll notice this expression, despite some fluctuations, for the majority of the time. I've used these just to show that this is not always true, that sometimes some of the data decreases, and at certain points in the graph, Chinese tourists actually spent more than tourists from other places. But because we're looking at the data in general, this just means that everything is accurate. Now we've successfully covered the overview, so we're going to move on to our detailed paragraphs. The most important thing when looking at detailed paragraphs is dividing our data logically. If you don't divide your data logically between the 2 paragraphs, you will not get over a band 5 for your coherence and cohesion. This is another very important reason why you should be following this band 9 structure for your academic task 1 essays. So let's have a look at our data and see how we can logically group this. So remember, we've got to group it into 2 sections. At the moment, we have 5 countries. So the logical thing to do at the moment is think about having 2 countries in one paragraph and 3 countries in the other paragraph. With this graph, all our data has exactly the same trend. If everything is the same trend, the easiest way to group our data is simply looking at what were the highest and what were the lowest categories. We can see that Australia and the USA are our 2 highest categories. So let's put those 2 into the first details paragraph, and then the remaining countries will go into the second details paragraph. That will be the UK, Japan, and China. So here you can see next to our details paragraphs how we are going to group this data. Let's focus on details paragraph 1, and we'll start with Australia as it is the highest figure for the entire period. Right, once we start writing, we need to think about what are the important data points that we are going to refer to. Now, we can't refer to every year because that would mean our essay would be too long. We always report the very first piece of data, so that will be in 1996, and the final piece of data, which is going to be in 2014. I decided when looking at Australia, the important points were from 1996 to 2006, 2006, 2008, 2008, 2010, and 2010 to 2014. I think by describing only these 4 points, the examiner is going to have a very good idea of exactly what the data is going to look like. So here we said in 1996, Australian tourists spent around 1,000 New Zealand dollars. And this figure increased to approximately 2,400 in 2006. Over the next 2 years, it declined to roughly $2,000 before rising again to about 2,300 in 2010. Finally, from 2010 to 2014, it fell slightly to just over $2,000. You must use approximations in your writing if the exact data is not given. So in this detailed paragraph, you'll see I've actually included quite a variation of approximations. So we've got the word around, approximately, roughly, about, just over. These are really good ways to show that your data is not exact. In most line graphs that you have, you're not going to know the exact data, so make sure you use these approximations. Even if the rest of your essay is perfect, but you forget to use approximations, you will not get over a band 6 for your task response. So you can see how important using approximations are. We're still looking at detailed paragraph 1, but this time I'm going to start looking at the United States of America. So just like with Australia, I want to pick the key data points. So we start at the beginning. I think the next important data point is going to be in 2010. And then we always include the final data point. The way I worded this part of detailed paragraph 1 was at the beginning of the period. Once again, you see, I'm being very, very clear about the exact point in time I'm referring to. American tourists spent around $800, and this figure rose to a peak of around $1,700 in 2010, after which it decreased to finish the period at about $1,200. Make sure you use expressions to indicate a continuation of time. Some good examples of this would be after which, following that, or and then. This means that your writing flows naturally. This will help with your coherence and cohesion. Those were the two categories we had to include in details paragraph 1. So now we've finished that paragraph as well, and we move on to the final paragraph. So we're going to go in order of Japan, UK, and China, as these were the highest, second highest, and lowest at the beginning of the period. For Japan, I feel there are 3 key points. As always, we have the start and end point. And I think 2002 was a key point as well. To report this data, I said in 1996, Japanese tourists spent approximately $500, and their spending increased to just over 1,000 New Zealand dollars in 2002. However, this figure fell until it reached just over $500 in 2014. You'll notice here that I'm using conjunctions to show contrast. So some good conjunctions to show contrast are while, although, or however. The next category is going to be the UK. For the UK, I thought the start point was important. 2002 was important. And I'm going to draw a line from 2002, 2012, and then a final line down to the end of the period. Here we said tourists from the UK started the period spending just less than those from Japan. So here I'm showing some comparison with another category. But this expenditure declined over the following 6 years to reach a low of around $200. It then increased to around $1,000 in 2012, before dropping again to roughly $750 2 years later. Now we only have one category left to talk about, and that is China. The important points here are our start point at 1996, moving to 2004, 2008, and then ending in 2014. Finally, moving on to China, I've said the expenditure of Chinese tourists was almost nothing in 1996. although it increased to a peak of nearly $500 in 2004. This figure fell over the following 4 years to around $200. However, after 2008, it rose again for the remainder of the period, reaching roughly $300 in 2014. What I would like you to note about this section of the second details paragraph is the way I have varied my language when talking about my subject. The first time I mention the subject, I say the expenditure of Chinese tourists. The next time I refer to my subject as it. This is a referencing pronoun. In the next sentence, I use the expression this figure. And then following that, once again, I use a referencing pronoun to reference this figure. To get a high score for lexical resource, it is really important to make sure that you are varying your language throughout your writing. Now we've completed all 4 paragraphs, and we have a final essay, which would be of a band 9 level. I recommend that you pause the video, read through the essay, and use some of the language that you see in this essay in your own essays. Have a look at the techniques. Make sure that you are using approximations. Don't forget to use a wide range of vocabulary and a mix of grammatical structures throughout your writing. If you found this useful, I conduct one-to-one lessons, group lessons, essay corrections, and mock speaking tests at my Facebook study group. The address to that page is on the screen now, or you can just email me directly at one-to-one-IELTS@gmail.com. Good luck to you all in your studies. Please don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button if you'd like to see more content like this in the future.